Thank you to the CHSA for the invitation to speak about ongoing work that is rooted in the impacts of specification writing practices in the United States. There is a quick backstory to this work, mainly because it has somewhat departed from the original abstract I wrote for the CHSA conference in 2019, as well as a departure from the material focus of Indiana limestone. R. Guastavino and the Lithic Ghost had examined the specifications written for Guastavino work in Riverside Church and St. John the Divine, and this was the original abstract. But because most of the company's work had also supported the nation state building of the United States, as I started to look further into specification writing in the 19th century, as well as the early 20th century, the work evolved from a building scale to a territorial scale. Specifications are still the common thread, but the focus has shifted to the connection between specification writing and territories of extraction. This presentation is based in a paper I wrote for the 7th International Congress on Construction History titled "The Specification as an Instrument for Colonizing Oceti-Sakowin Lands," as well as an architectural studio called the Spec Studio I have co-taught with Federico Garcia Lammers for the past 2 years. And as the work continues to develop, I wanted to share it with members of the CHSA and others who are interested in the Americas, since the work is rooted here. In 1782, the national border of the United States of America appeared much different than the current border we may be familiar with. In this map, the heavy white line indicates the original 13 colonies that lie along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. And within the borders of the US were white pine forest, from which timber was extracted to construct many of the initial northeastern settlements. White pine offered resilience to warping and shrinking. In colonial America, it became an easy material to work with. And at the start of the 19th century, the United States positioned itself for industrial expansion by identifying potential territories for raw materials, including white pine. Sources for the timber were identified to the west of the nation, but much of the land was already occupied by indigenous peoples, such as the Oceti-Sakowin peoples, whose borderless land is seen here, intersecting with the edge of white pine territory. The hatch stippling indicates that. Oceti-Sakowin means 7 council fires, which is the proper name for the peoples referred to as Sioux. So many of you are probably familiar with Oceti-Sakowin figures such as Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, and Crazy Horse. And currently I am presenting from Oceti-Sakowin lands, which is also something that extends into current states such as Minnesota, North Dakota, and Nebraska. What ensued were a series of violent colonial practices, including wars and massacres that expanded the territory of the United States and split Oceti-Sakowin lands into 9 separate nations far from white pine territory. These are often referred to as reservations, which includes the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe located here, which is the nation I am a citizen of. This paper in this presentation is primarily concerned with how these colonial processes were made physical through the built environment. In At the Border of Decolonization, Andrew Herscher and Ana Maria Leon unfold colonial processes as, quote, the practice of seizing land from indigenous peoples. Colonization depends on the transformation of land and water into bordered territory that can be claimed, surveyed, defined, depopulated, and resettled, unquote. At the heart of these colonial practices, which do continue today, were a series of conflicts and negotiations solidified through political agreements. And treaties compromised the original political agreements made between the United States and indigenous peoples to border land into possessed territories. From 1805 to 1868, 34 treaties were negotiated between the U.S. and Oceti-Sakowin Oyates, or nations. Treaties became synonymous with the colonization of indigenous lands. They were also precarious and controversial, mainly because of representation and interpretation. This is why many treaties were written without full representation of a Oyate or nation present. But what was also controversial was that the language between the parties was a hindrance. English was favored, and later on, several treaties were broken. In fact, treaty writing between the United States and indigenous nations abruptly ended with the 1871 Indian Appropriations Act. Though seemingly empty territories had already been surveyed, defined, and mostly depopulated at this time, spaces had only started to be resettled by the US. But in place of treaties, new forms of political agreements further expanded the US's control of resource extraction territories. At the same time, the architecture and construction community in the US embarked on a structuring of agreements through organizations that governed the social, economic, and labor culture of building sites. Specification writing emerged as a practice borrowed from England, and the specification spread as an instrument of practice with the founding of the American Institute of Architects in 1857 and the subsequent professionalization of architecture in the United States. Beyond the legal requirements they address, specifications offer a written format for architects and engineers to select or disregard certain types of materials and to translate the organization and sequence of work on a construction site from architect to contractor. As technical documents, specifications allowed architects to control building sites from a distance. But as political agreements, specifications tied architects to the vast territories needed for resource extraction and material production. By examining initial treaties written between the US and Oceti-Sakowin peoples, early specifications written for white pine houses, and later specifications written by white pine institutions, this presentation unfolds the specification as a political instrument for further colonizing Oceti-Sakowin lands. Back to the map. Oceti-Sakowin peoples originated from a single council fire among the pine forests of Midewakan. The Confederation eventually split into Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota divisions, with each band occupying various locations within Oceti-Sakowin lands. Solid borders and permanent dwellings did not define the land, but rather intergenerational habitation by the peoples in the Northern Plains region of North America. This was recognized and sometimes contested by neighboring peoples such as the Ojibwe peoples, who dubbed Oceti-Sakowin peoples Narewasu, a word meaning little enemy. And of course, this name was later shortened to Sioux by French settlers. So before discussing the treaty that's on the left of the screen, I do want to turn our attention to white pine forest, which lied within both Oceti-Sakowin and Anishinaabe lands. This excerpt from George W. Hotchkiss's 1898 publication, History of the Lumber and Forest Industry of the Northwest, establishes an origin for white pine lumber and the industry in the territory of Minnesota, even before Minnesota was declared a state in 1858. So I'm going to read it. Quote, "The first pine cut in the state of Minnesota was in 1818 at Rum River and was used in the construction of Fort Snelling. The fort being sufficiently advanced for occupancy by 1822, a sawmill was built under supervision of the officers at the fort at the Falls of St. Anthony near Minneapolis," unquote. In 1805, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike was sent to secure land for a military fort. And the land that comprises present-day Minneapolis was secured through a treaty with the Dakota peoples of the Seven Council Fires. And this is what we see on the left, the Treaty with the Sioux of 1805. So these white pine industrial and military origins resulted from the 1805 Treaty with the Sioux. And certainly material industrialization and militarization go hand in hand. And the first article of the treaty reads, quote, "that the Sioux Nation grants unto the United States for the purpose of the establishment of military post 9 square miles at the mouth of the River St. Croix," unquote. Beyond the cession of land, which is seen here with the white border, the treaty also established early tactics for treaty writing. First, the treaty identified the Oceti-Sakowin Confederation as a sovereign nation. And second, the Confederation was given authority to grant land to the US. Official ratification of this particular treaty was contested, mainly because Lieutenant Pike acted as an agent of the US without authority, and because Dakota leaders who needed translators did not represent all Oceti-Sakowin peoples. Nonetheless, the treaty manifested an initial territory for the processing of white pine. And linked to this established processing site were white pine specifications, which grew out of the first sawmill and military fort constructed at St. Anthony Falls and Fort Snelling. So we see the images here. While the selection of white pine could be made explicit in specification writing, more implicit were the territories needed for resource extraction. And in his book, Empire, State, and Building, Colonial explains the connection between the specification and territory by stating, quote, "It is evident that every specification for construction immediately evokes a specific territory, a specific intake and circulation of matter/energy, and has a specific inherent velocity, all of which remain abstract and unknown to architects," unquote. Those specifications are briefly explored in Moe's examination of Empire State Building. Moe's statement regarding their invisible impact upon territory is profound. Some of the first specifications written in the US were by architects who designed wood frame buildings in the mid-19th century. And these were largely distributed through building manuals and pattern books written for the houses intended to fill newly expanded US territory. One pattern book was George E. Woodward and Edward G. Thompson's Woodward's National Architect, which was published in 1869. And here we can see a couple pages from that book. Based in New York, Woodward and Thompson understood the role of specification writing in maintaining control of building sites from a distance. And in the introduction, they wrote, quote, "The forms of specifications given are such that they may be adapted to any of the designs so that full and final estimates can be obtained from local builders. They will also serve as hints for the preparation of specifications for any class of dwelling house," unquote. The author's promise of adaptable specifications is made evident in generic language used to define timber quality and type. They say here, and it's highlighted in green, "Furnish all timber used in the construction of good, sound, square edge quality, free from any and every imperfection tending to impair its durability or strength, and as well seasoned as any convenient market will afford. The sills, post, floor joist, and rafters to be of chestnut, pine, or spruce, and the remaining framing timber of hemlock, pine, or spruce at the option of the contractor," unquote. Quality was interpretable, as classification systems were non-existent at this point, and the species of wood was left to the local market availability. So contractors were given agency to choose the quality and type of wood depending on their location. In spite of the generic language used on the previous page for accommodating local materials, there were moments of specificity that did arise in modes of construction made possible, particularly through white pine. So here we see that the lumber is somewhat being alluded to. It says, quote, "Furnish all the lumber of white pine were not otherwise specified," and it goes on, unquote. This material focus directive speaks to the ubiquity of white pine as an already available construction material treaties offered a strategy for removing indigenous peoples. Specifications aided in the resettling of indigenous lands. U.S. legislative acts such as the 1862 Homestead Act encouraged and further enabled white settlers to claim up to 160 acres of surveyed plots if they could live and build upon them. As land was surveyed and sectioned into individual plots, U.S. citizens and immigrants flooded to the northern Great Plains to become property owners. And at this point in time, the white pine industry had its consumers. This form of colonialism, called settler colonialism, is an ongoing form of inhabitation that seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers. Structures like houses, which we can see here, are key to demonstrating settlement through their permanence. And pattern books with drawings and specifications like Woodward's National Architect proliferated, along with the expansion of lumber processing and shipping needed to move lumber to remote locations. For Dakotas, Lakotas, and Nakotas, the encroachment of the white pine lumber industry reached a climax with the introduction of railroads needed to move materials. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty became the final treaty written between Oceti-Sakowin peoples and the United States. Before its signing, Dakotas had been pushed to western lands occupied by their Lakota and Nakota kin as a result of military conflicts that accompanied the industrial practices near the ceded lands of the first 1805 treaty we had seen earlier. And ultimately, the treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, seen here in green, west of the Missouri River, and railroad construction was made explicit within the agreement. So this article that we see here is Article 11, which compelled Lakotas to relinquish territory outside of defined reservations and to ignore U.S. settlers traveling through the territory. So I won't read it, I'll continue past it. Still, the territories needed for white pine extraction and production were in flux. And in 1871, as settlement making soared, treaty writing between the U.S. and indigenous tribes abruptly ended with the Indian Appropriations Act. The act stipulated, quote, that no Indian nation or tribe within the territory of the United States shall be acknowledged or recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty, unquote. With treaty making removed as a political instrument for colonizing indigenous lands, specifications helped to further delineate territories needed for resource extraction. And from the generic specifications we saw written by George E. Woodward and Edward G. Thompson for Woodward's National Architect in 1869, which was published 1 year after the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty, we begin to see the evolution of white pine specification writing. Generic specifications organized according to a housing type gave way to guides written by material producers and institutions for optimizing material selection according to lumber grades and classifications. In this way, specifications for white pine became more specific. Lumbermen's directories and reference books of the United States and Canada categorize wholesale, retail, commission dealers, and manufacturers according to locations and types of timber sought or dealt in. So we're seeing here Rand McNally, there's a publication from 1891 and a subsequent publication from 1893. And these books offer rules for inspection, classification, measurement of lumber. They also provided state laws for lumbering. And by the end of the 19th century, Minnesota, which was an official U.S. state, dominated white pine production. So lumbering in Minnesota became synonymous with white pine. And so we start to see that there's more first-class sawmills. And certainly by 1880, there were 17 mills in Minneapolis, all valued and producing lumber, all at $7 million in 1890, which is a significant amount of money, certainly. By the early 20th century, the standards and classification systems described in lumber directories and reference books transformed specification practices by issuing optimized guides for architects to reference. Bureaus and associations formed to market lumber for use in construction. And in 1915, the White Pine Bureau organized and established its headquarters in St. Paul, Minnesota, across the river from white pine sawmills in Minneapolis. The Bureau represented two white pine organizations, the Northern Pine Manufacturers Association of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Michigan is also a part of that, and that's seen here in magenta, as well as a few other manufacturers associations. But in the context of colonization, the guide that's provided here further delineated and tightened the territories in order to specify white pine elements according to class and grade. And architects were able to specify by first selecting the territory from which the lumber could be extracted from. And finally, in this slide, we can see how the tightly defined territory is used in the index of the guide to point architects to the materials and elements they may select. This is perhaps where we need to conclude. From the first white pine tree cut along the Rum River in 1818 to the material standardized production, specifications written for white pine construction were entangled in the territorial marginalization of Ochati lands. As political agreements, treaties and specifications are both accountable for the creation of territories. Although the delineation of seemingly unsettled land is more directly linked to treaty negotiations, specifications create an initial need for territories and the raw materials they possess. And the increased selection of a certain material or a product expands territories to meet demand. The evolution of white pine specifications from the mid-19th century to early 20th century further supports this correlation. Generic language written in pattern books such as Woodward's National Architect of 1869 indicate unknown territories for the extraction and production of lumber. In the book, directives written for houses intended to resettle newly acquired territories in the US offered substitutes in the absence of materials like white pine. But later, specifications written in the early 20th century by institutions such as the White Pine Bureau indicate a shift in precision. Size and quality of the material were meticulously considered. As territorial borders and locations solidified, so too did points of extraction, sawmill construction for processing, railroad expansion to move the material, and military forts to defend the territories. Ultimately, precise specifications advanced specific territories. In architecture and construction, the contemporary effects of white pine extraction and its production into lumber in Ochati-Sakowin lands extend beyond a simple reckoning with settler colonial practices, which, of course, are ongoing and continue. Instead, specifications must be understood as instruments for connecting seemingly benign material selection to vast territories. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Anthony Hita, architectural conservator and architectural historian. I run the laboratory at limeworks.us, north of Philadelphia. And today I'm going to be talking to you about materials fit for purpose, the importance of kiln temperature and preparation in selecting limestone-derived products for use in historic preservation. This is an important topic because while we may know some of the differences between things like lime and Portland cement, we're on the growing frontier of realizing that there needs to also be distinguishing marks between different types of limes. So, lime is one of humanity's oldest materials. We've been using lime since circa 6000 BCE, and the methods of its production have remained largely unchanged since the Romans first mastered the use of traditional lime materials in the 3rd century BCE. However, starting in the mid-19th century in the US, new building styles, economics, and demographic changes, and the ease of use and availability of Portland cements resulted in cement dominating as the preferred binder for masonry materials. As a result, Portland cement's production and use is relatively well understood, while other forms of limestone-derived masonry materials like natural cement and lime are not as well studied or differentiated beyond broad categories. In this presentation, I will briefly discuss different limestone-derived binders and, focusing particularly on lime, discuss why preservation-minded professionals must consider the source and preparation technique of raw materials and not just the broad category of binder types. In its simplest form, mortars and plasters are essentially made with 3 ingredients: aggregate, binder, and water. But the various properties of these 3 ingredients can result in radically different products. Historically speaking, humans have most commonly used these 6 binders either alone or in combination with each other to form mortars and plasters. Now, for most of human history, clay, gypsum, and aerial and hydraulic limes were the most commonly available binders. Starting in the late 18th century, natural cement became available, with Portland cement following in the late 19th century. So, on the scale of human history, Portland and natural cement are relative newcomers, having been in use only for about 200 years or less, while the other binder types have been in use for thousands of years. Now, each of these binder categories has subcategories that can be potentially important for material properties. For instance, Portland cements are made in 2 broad categories, white and gray, and 5 different types intended for different purposes, curing times, and sulfate resistance. Unfortunately, though, for the other binder types, there is not widespread awareness of the importance of these differentiations, and often not even industry categories recognizing them. For today's lecture, we're going to be focusing on the binders derived from limestone, and specifically on the hydraulic limes, as that is what my expertise is in. Now, there are a wide variety of materials made from limestone that are available on the American market today, and that can be intimidating and confusing for both amateurs and professionals alike, since often the most readily available and cheapest materials are not necessarily the most appropriate. Now, we really don't have time in this lecture today to dive into all of these, but I provide the slide you're looking at now as a quick reference for the broad categories of binder types available on the American market. Within each of these product categories are a wide variety of materials being prepared in varying ways and sourced from various kinds of limestone. As conservation professionals become more accustomed to selecting appropriate product classes, we need to also grow increasingly critical of product production to maximize the compatibility with sensitive historic fabric. Often, industry wisdom tells us to replace materials like to like. But practically, this is virtually impossible. Changes in material sourcing, production, and application mean that even if the material were made in similar proportions, there are likely significant differences in the component ingredients. Instead of like to like, we need to consider what is most likely to be compatible and sympathetic to the sensitive historic masonry around it. The 5 factors displayed right now are my synthesis of common approach towards best practice in the field of architectural conservation. While these factors are excellent and should be carefully regarded, they fail to include consideration of the nuances within binder types. There are significant differences in all classes of limestone-derived products, such that simply saying lime should be replaced with lime, for example, is not fully sufficient. The next frontier for conservation, particularly in America, is consideration not just of the broad binder type, but also of the specific differences between types of products or brands within each broad category of binder. What can make these differences even more confusing is that, essentially, most mortar materials are part of the same family tree, with Portlands, natural cements, and lime varieties all starting life as limestone of one type or another. Indeed, the differences between them largely lie in the specific processes of raw material selection and the procedures followed during production. Changing or failing to regulate any of these steps can result in products that behave in radically different ways, and even behave more like a totally different family of product altogether. Another way we might consider these relationships is in a spectrum from lime to cement. As the heat increases and is sustained, materials with added or naturally occurring silica and alumina content tend to move further from what we recognize as lime and closer to what we call cement. As you increase the heat and the time in the kiln and move further towards the cement spectrum, that results in products that are generally going to set faster, be stronger, denser, and less flexible or more brittle. Take, for example, this generalized phase diagram of a typical gray Portland cement. While the specific materials here may change from limestone to limestone, they are generally present in some form naturally in limestone or added for most cement and limestone production. And so, this phase diagram is broadly useful beyond just Portland cements. The 3 most important contents for our discussion today are the amount of free lime, tricalcium silicate, and tricalcium aluminates formed during the kilning process. Free lime is the amount of calcium oxide available to react with silicates when hydrated, and is formed when carbon dioxide begins to be driven off from limestones above 800 degrees centigrade. Tricalcium silicate, also known as alite or C3S in cement notation, is a complex fusion of oxides containing silica and calcium, and is responsible for the formation of calcium silicate hydrate, or CSH in cement notation. This is what gives Portland its strength. C3S begins to form around 1200 degrees C, which is why Portland cement is generally kilned quite hot, at temperatures approaching 1500 degrees C. Tricalcium aluminate, or C3A, on the other hand, is a fusion of alumina and calcium oxides that increase the risk it's the fusion of aluminum and calcium silicates. While C3A does react quickly with water to produce early strength, its presence also opens material up to increased risks, and so its presence is usually minimized in modern cement production. However, because both natural and added alumina can be used to make a hydraulic lime, it's not always controlled for in the same way in lime production. While free lime content is certainly desirable in limes of all types, there can be such a thing as too much free lime. If the kiln is not hot enough, or if there is not enough hydraulic clays naturally within the stone, not enough free lime will recombine into belite, resulting in a mortar product that is much too calcium oxide rich. When hydrated, calcium oxide expands about 90%, leaving relatively large, frequent voids in the cured product. Not only do these voids weaken the material flexurally and compressively, but they also contribute to drawing in excess moisture, which brings with it dissolved salts and sulfates, two of the most deleterious substances to masonry. In mixes that are combined with cements or have a great deal of alite, the free lime has no place to go and is jettisoned from the curing material, forming aesthetically unpleasing calcite streaks often known as lime run. A materials rich in hydraulic material, failure to control the temperature of the kiln by burning too hot or for too long results in mixes rich in alite. Alite, which forms tight needle-like networks, increases the capillarity of the material, while driving up its density and down its vapor permeability. So while it takes longer to get wet, when it does get wet, the water and any dissolved materials in it are drawn deeper into the material, where they are held on to much longer, contributing to deterioration from a variety of sources, most commonly salt crystallization, freeze-thaw damage, and gypsum incrustation. Because the sweet spot between belite and free lime content is also right around the point where tricalcium aluminates form in alumina-containing limestones, failure to precisely control the kiln can result in excess C3A. Due to its eminent hydraulicity in moist environments, in humid conditions, C3A-rich materials can develop a condition known as runaway strength, where lime gains much more strength than anticipated. For example, an alumina-rich NHL2, which one would expect to have a 28-day strength of 2 megapascals, might gain as much as 5 to 8 megapascals in the right conditions. While this may not be a problem for certain hardy masonry, it can be especially problematic in soft masonry, where low density and compressive strength of an NHL2 is often specified. Less commonly, but still a threat, high C3A limes can swell in the presence of sulfates due to delayed intringite formation, leading to cracking and weakening of the material. To prevent the formation of excess C3A, producers may undercook their lime, which can result in excess free lime, leading us back to the problem discussed in point number 1. Now, on some level, these kinds of minute differences can seem unimportant, or like we academics are splitting hairs. However, in certain environments, they really can matter in a practical way. Indeed, in historic preservation, these kinds of sensitive materials are very common. For example, in soft masonry, such as low-fired or handmade brick, and certain types of soft stone like brownstone, a small difference in density can be the difference between a good water-regulating system that protects the masonry or a water-trapping system that leads to deleterious results. In these places, using a product in high C3A or in alites could literally be the difference between preservation or further deterioration. Likewise, in urban environments where de-icing salts and sulfates from vehicles and industries are common, A material high in C3A, in halites, or in free lime will face deleterious conditions from a variety of conditions, including gypsum incrustation, salt crystallization, or possible delayed intringite formation, just to name a few. Now, we could probably have a lecture on any one of these contexts and anything mentioned in this slide. And there are certainly more things that I'm not listing. But suffice to say, it really isn't quite as simple as the old mantra of remove Portland and replace it with lime, as is becoming quite common in historic masonry in the US right now. Modern Portland cement production is highly studied and regulated, and as a result, most brands of Portland cement are reliably interchangeable, apart from minor differences in things like color. However, in hydraulic lime production, there is not yet quite the kind of wide, tight industry regulation that produces consistent and reliable products across brands. This is partly because, unlike most Portland cement, hydraulic lime brands are tightly tied to their originating quarry, and tighter regulations might completely change the classification of certain companies' products, or even eliminate some quarries entirely from calling their product a hydraulic lime. This means that the specifier must be a bit savvy in what questions they ask and what kind of products they seek, as quarry mineralogy, specifically the amount and nature of the silica and alumina clays, and the calcium carbonate in the stone, can very predictably result in certain quarks in some brands of hydraulic lime. When a brand is not associated with a quarry, this can make things even more difficult because you may be dealing with a repackaged product from an unknown producer or a manufactured product that will require extra scrutiny. Because of how tightly tied to quarries most brands are, you can usually predict what kind of product they are producing just by knowing a little bit about the source limestone. Thus, if a quarry is known to produce high alumina limestone, but the manufacturer is not disclosing high alumina content, you can probably guess that there may be more to the story that requires investigation. In general, honest products are going to provide honest data, while companies with inconsistent products or no testing will not be able to produce numbers over time and may not, as a result, have reliable products. Now, that doesn't mean those products can't be used, but it does put an extra onus on us as specifiers to do extra testing. Now, just because one kind of lime is inappropriate in one context or application doesn't mean that the company is producing a bad product or that their limes are inappropriate in all situations. For example, a company that consistently produces high alumina lime that is both well disclosed and well understood may not be appropriate for soft masonry in humid environments due to runaway strength, but it could be perfectly suited for denser masonry in more temperate climates. Likewise, a lime with a higher free lime content might be risky in an urban setting, but it could be perfectly okay to use on soft masonry in very dry settings like the desert Southwest. The key, though, is that we cannot just assume that all limes are interchangeable. We must do our diligence. Most specifiers start with mortar analysis, but while mortar analysis can tell us much about the current or original mortars, it leaves key questions unanswered. Specifically, mortar analysis cannot tell us about the original density or compressive strength of the mortar, and there is no reliable way to determine these properties, as mortar sections rarely have enough volume or a consistent enough shape to measure. And by the time we are testing in situ mortars, the mortar is also at the end of its service life, and the host masonry may have been modified due to weathering, meaning that we're not getting an accurate picture of what should be replaced. Instead, we should include testing of the host masonry that includes things like density testing, compressive strength, and absorption. The testing is going to need to be on the project side, as manufacturers cannot reasonably be expected to know how their products will interact in every single unique context. We should also take a careful consideration of the site context and its history. Was this an industrial site that may have sulfate residue? Is this in a rural area that was once a farm and may have nitrite salts in the soil? Is it in a cold climate and near a road or sidewalk where salting is common in the winter? How wet is the climate? How many freeze-thaw cycles happen in a year? That's obviously not an exhaustive list of questions, but it gives us an idea of what things we should think of to ask. With context and testing data on original mortar and masonry, we are now better equipped to understand the limit replacement mixes need to stay within. ASTM C1713 provides good guidance on what kinds of tests should be performed on mortars meant for historic masonry. Ideally, manufacturers should be performing these tests and have that data freely available, but not all do. If no testing data is available, then the onus falls on the specifier to do the testing. But that is generally impractical and expensive, so it can't be done for most projects. Of these tests, the most important will be compressive strength, flexural strength, vapor permeability, and water absorption at 28 days, 6 months, 1 year, and optimally out to 2 years. These tests allow us to compare the materials to the host masonry over time to ensure plausible compatibility. Remember, mortars and plasters will gain or lose strength over time, so we cannot just assume that 28-day number is going to be good representation of the entire life of the material. On the specifier end, it can be prudent to do these tests in job site conditions to at least 28 days to confirm that the manufacturer's numbers are reliable or are within a reasonable margin. If project side testing cannot show a product to be reliable, then you may want to consider using a different product. In conclusion, the topics we are exploring today is quite detailed, and we could probably fill a whole semester of lectures. And there are, of course, factors beyond those mentioned here that are also important to consider in product selection. In this admittedly shallow dive, I hope that I have at least started the process of giving you the kinds of variations that exist in the market and the kinds of questions you should be asking when planning a project using limestone-derived materials. Very few manufacturers are making bad products, so this should not be seen as an endorsement of or condemnation of any specific product or brand. Rather, it should place the duty on us as users to increase our awareness of what exists and the potential pitfalls we might fall into if we aren't careful in product selection, as it really is not as simple as replacing like to like. Mineralogy of source limestone, kiln procedures, and production techniques can all matter in the final product. These differences can matter more or less based on the individual context, and there is no one-size-fits-all limestone product, no matter what anybody tries and tells you. As such, specifiers in particular should take care to obtain the right data on their products and their projects to ensure maximum compatibility and increase the chance that intervention will be non-damaging and therefore successful on the historic fabric. In other words, materials should be shown to fit the purpose for which they are intended. Thank you for your time and your attention. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be presenting some interesting findings during research we performed during the restoration of Richard Upjohn's Trinity Church in New York. My name is Assya Plavskina. I used to work as a conservator for Building Conservation Associates, who's in charge of the restoration at Trinity Church. I was project manager for the design of this project and part of the restoration work. I've since moved on to Prospect Park Alliance in Brooklyn, at which point Alex took over as the project manager.
Hi, I'm Alex Ray, conservator with Building Conservation Associates. I started off working on the archival research that we're going to talk about today. And as Assya mentioned, I'm currently in the role of project manager. I also want to mention our co-contributor, Raymond Pepi, principal in charge at BCA, who's been involved in the project from the beginning. But today, Assya and I will take you through this presentation of selected findings.
So Building Conservation Associates recently completed a restoration campaign at the interior of Trinity Church on Wall Street in New York. And as part of the design of the project, we really want to perform a wide breadth of research, archival, materials research, and in situ conditions inspections to make sure that we really understood the construction of the church and the choices that were made as part of the design intent. And in this presentation, we'll present some of those select findings and the implications these findings had on the restoration.
Okay, so to start with a brief overview of the history of Trinity Church, beginning with the establishment of its parish in 1697 as part of the Episcopal Diocese of New York. The current Trinity Church is the third church building to be built on the site, and it was constructed between 1839 to 46, according to the design of architect Richard Upjohn. And Trinity Church is considered one of the earliest examples of Gothic Revival architecture in the United States. I also want to point out a later addition to the original building, the Reredos, designed by Frederick Clark Withers in 1877. So an important aspect of the original design that we're going to discuss today is the use of decorative plaster to imitate masonry construction. And this is a feature that was actually reinstated as part of the recently completed restoration project. And so you can see on the left a view of the nave ceiling. You can see the decorative differentiated color blocking scheme, paint scheme that's used to simulate the appearance of coursed masonry units. And then on the right, you can see the true stone columns in context with the painted walls. The columns are a New Jersey sandstone. Another view of the overall composition, looking across the center aisle. Everything you see in this image, with the exception of the wood pews, is either plaster or stone. In fact, the stone is limited to those structural stone columns with the carved colonnette capitals, as well as the window tracery behind, which plays a load-bearing role in the exterior wall assembly. And just to give a brief overview of the restoration project, the goals of the project were, in no particular order, restoration of deteriorated materials at the building, which is the subject of this presentation, treatment of previous alterations that had occurred over time at the church, as well as a comprehensive upgrade of building systems to allow for continued use of the building well into the future. And so we're going to share today, as Assya mentioned, sort of these two parallel tracks of research and investigation that we undertook during the design of this project. Assya will share findings from the materials research that help us understand the conditions as they exist today. And I'm going to speak first about the archival research, which we performed to identify the construction chronology of the building and, as much as we could, reveal the original design intent. So we consulted, among other sources, the original architectural drawings, a number of contracts, account books, meeting minutes, correspondence dating from the period of construction that was housed at Trinity's own internal archives, and a variety of other sources to accumulate images for reference and other publications. But I want to specifically mention the Trinity Wall Street archives were a particularly valuable source of information. As you can imagine, the church's own records of the construction of their building were quite comprehensive, and Trinity had been established its practice as a record-keeping institution for over 150 years, beginning with the establishment of their parish before this building was built. So they certainly had a impressive infrastructure in place for keeping records about their activities. And in particular, of special use to us were the meeting minutes of the building committee, which separately from the business dealings of the parish, these meeting minutes provided a weekly construction update recorded in real time, which is a quite unusual level of detail to have on one building. That's quite valuable for us. So I'm going to share some of the archival items that we consulted first, beginning with this sheet from a plasterer's timekeeping book. And so this is the first sort of piece of evidence that we used, a combination of archival sources to reveal the original design intent that I mentioned and the construction sequencing of the plaster, which occurred between 1843 and 45. So this particular entry from the timekeeping book is from 1843, August 15th, 1843, which suggests that at least by that time, the plaster work was underway at the building. The next item that I'll share is a letter dated from later in 1844, February 5th, from Richard Upjohn, written to the building committee that I mentioned. And I should also point out that the building committee, as I said, was tasked with overseeing the construction of the church. And in fact, all the contracts held with the different trades working on the building were held and administered by this committee, as was the employment of their architect, Richard Upjohn. So Richard Upjohn is writing in this letter in February of 1844 to the building committee, basically recommending that as the building is approaching completion, he's recommending to postpone the interior finishing, as he says, and to do it all except the very last touches until after the exterior walls and tower are established their full load-bearing configuration to, as he says, then apply the coloring and finish to the entire scene. So a recommended pause in the work, and that's sort of the first event in a series that I'm going to sort of outline here. But also Assya will speak in more detail about what we learned through the materials investigation in detail about what these finishing processes may have consisted of in terms of the materials. And I should also add that we do get confirmation in March of 1844 from a routine sort of construction status update that in fact by that time, early 1844, a significant portion of the plaster work was complete and essentially awaiting these finishing touches that Upjohn describes. So the next item is another letter written to the building committee from a few months later, from May 7th, 1844. And this is a letter from Joshua Clark to the building committee. And Joshua Clark is writing in defense of himself in light of a dispute that has come up that has caused certainly a schedule delay, if not another, this time unplanned, pause in the work. And Joshua Clark is the plaster contractor job. And so his issue that he raises here, that this delay has come about, as he says, starts off saying, I was superintended by a Mr. Vanderberg, who we know to be the master mason on the project. And his name appears in commemorative publications coming out around the time of the opening of the building. His name appears just under Richard Upjohn's in these publications, just to give you a sense of the prominence of his role on the job site, which apparently included supervising the plaster work, despite himself being a mason. So Joshua Clark's complaint here is basically that, in his opinion, Mr. Vanderberg is not qualified to oversee his work. He describes here that he's interfering with the man under me. And importantly, he says he was ordering my work, plaster work, to be retinted or retouched or patched up in some ways, thus marring its freshness, originality, and beauty. So this is another important point in the chronology of the plaster sequencing where we get this evidence that the work was disrupted and retouched, even in addition to the pause that Upjohn had recommended already. And Joshua Clark goes on to make a passionate defense of his approach to the work. And he ends his letter with a request that, if the work is to continue under him, the building committee will please arrange it so that no person shall stand between myself and Mr. Upjohn. So that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, which is an entry from the building committee weekly minutes that I mentioned, where just a week later on May 14th, 1844, the committee takes up this issue of the letter from Joshua Clark, and basically they resolve that there's no grounds for the committee to intervene in this dispute. They find no one to be at fault, despite acknowledging the schedule delay. But they go on to report that at the meeting, 2 estimates were produced by the architect for completing the plastering and stucco work, remaining work, which suggests that a resolution was not able to be reached with Joshua Clark. And in fact, shortly after that, the next item is a new contract dated June 1st, 1844, between a new plaster contractor, Patrick Foley, and the building committee. And so this document identifies the remaining scope areas that were not completed, sort of identifying the balance of the work that remains to be done. And this document also gives us our definitive statement on the original intended finish appearance of the plaster. It says the last of which coats is to correspond in color with that of large stone columns. And the contract also includes a stipulation, and we don't have any previous contracts with Joshua Clark, for example, where this may have been not considered, or perhaps based on his letter, where it does state here that all the work under this contract is to be done under his superintendence, meaning the architect, Richard Upjohn, and to his satisfaction. So to sort of recap the chronology here that I just went through, we know that at least by 1843, the plastering work was in progress in the building. And then we have this sequence of events in 1844, which sort of paints a picture of the somewhat tumultuous circumstances around the plaster installation, where we first learn of the planned postponement of the finishing touches from Upjohn. We can perhaps speculate that the work resumed that spring after possibly weeks or months, leaving the plaster in various stages of completion in different parts of the building. And certainly we know by May 7th, the work had either slowed down or completely stopped as a result of this labor dispute that we learn about from Joshua Clark. But the building committee did resolve this quite swiftly and enter into a new contract in spring of 1844 with Patrick Foley to complete the work. And in fact, we have records of payments being made to Patrick Foley on this contract for until as late as October of that year. So quite a drawn out timeline for the plaster work. And just for context, the Trinity Church was consecrated on May 1st, 1846. So certainly the work was done by then. So Assya is going to take us through how our understanding of these events guided us sort of what to look for in the materials investigation that we undertook, on site, hands-on with those materials. But first, I want to just return to the first item that I showed, the excerpt from the plasterer's timekeeping log from the summer of 1843, where in fact we have the first two names on the list are Patrick Foley, J. Clark, Joshua Clark indicated as the foreman, and directly under him, Pat Foley indicated as the master. So despite everything I explained about the interruptions that we know about in the work, this is another important characteristic of the plaster assembly at Trinity Church that we should consider, which is the apparent continuity between the two contract holders who worked here for multiple years at Trinity Church and possibly on other projects. And there may have been things held in common in their techniques and their use of materials. So this is another thread that we tried to follow through the materials research, which Assya will take us through now.
So we performed materials analysis of many materials at Trinity Church, but I'll just focus on some of the more interesting findings this time around. The materials analysis were performed by hybrid materials testing, went with their labs in Delaware and also internally at our BCA labs. So the first material that we looked at was the plaster. In case those of you who don't know plaster stratigraphy, this is typical. The section that you see here is pretty typical plaster installation, where a base coat, which in the top left photograph you see as the whitish gray, that's applied over wood lath. And then above that is a finish coat, which you sort of see as the reddish brown. And then above that is our finishes layers. And we performed the analysis that you see on the right. And the goal of these analyses was to understand the composition and proportions of both the base coat and finished coat bases, and then hoping that that information would provide us some idea of the construction timeline, and also understanding the composition would allow us to understand the current the composition would allow us to understand the current condition of the plaster on a microscale level. We also took a look at the mortar. Now the interior and exterior of Trinity Church have been repointed several times throughout its lifetime, but we were really hoping to find some of the original pointing mortar, and we were able to do so. We found original pointing mortar at the window tracery. Holistically, it's mostly been repointed, but there was some original pointing mortar remaining. Most of the columns had the original pointing mortar. And then we were also surprised to learn that we found pointing mortar within the scored plaster joints of the plaster at the walls. Oftentimes in faux masonry plaster finishes, those plaster joints, the joints are painted in with a finish, but this time there actually was true mortar in there. And the goal of the analysis was similar to plaster, to understand the composition and approximate portions of the mix. And then this would lead us into identifying the condition of the current mortar and to better understand a replacement mix for where it would need to be replaced. We also performed some finishes analysis. What you see in that photograph is an exposure of the original plaster finish layer. This is actually one of the first things that we did when we got into the church, was do these exposures. And you can see that scored joint line there. This was actually probably the first time we found out that Trinity had this faux masonry finish, was during this exposure. It had been completely obscured through multiple layers of refinishing since. And the goal of our finishes analysis was to understand the composition and also try to understand what the intended appearance of that original finish was, and then to find a way whether it could be conserved or replaced with a similar finish. So let's talk about some of the findings of our plaster analysis. What you see here are photo micrographs, which show the composition of the finish coats at the top left, or excuse me, at the top, the bottom left, and the base coat at the top right. What we found about the base coat was that it was a mixture of gypsum plaster, hydrated lime, sand, and animal hair. And the gypsum was actually the predominant binder in this mix, and I'll speak more to that later. The finish coat was a mixture of lime, red pigment, and sand. The sand was actually crushed sand from the same stone that was used to build the columns, and that was made to mimic that stone appearance. The bottom left photograph, that photo micrograph, that is an epoxy impregnated sample, which means the epoxy is impregnated into the plaster sample, and the epoxy is blue. So everywhere where you see blue coming up in the photograph, that's an area of a void that's been filled by epoxy, and you can see there's quite a bit of voids. We found that the finish coat plaster mix was really highly sanded, which meant there was a lot of these voids, and that caused a sort of crumbly, fine, fragile plaster. And we did unfortunately see that in situ while performing a conditions assessment. So if we can talk about gypsum as a material for plaster mixes, obviously gypsum has been used for plaster for millennia, but in the United States and in the Northeast specifically, where Trinity Church is located, in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, was not a common material for wall plaster. We know that gypsum has been quarried for agricultural use since the early 19th century in New York, and you see there a quarry in that photograph. And around the mid-19th century, when this gypsum plaster was installed at Trinity for the wall plaster, really gypsum was mostly used as a plaster of Paris. So for decorative ornamental plaster or figurines was very common. But the first gypsum plaster production did not begin in New York until 1892. And when it began in 1892, that it became quickly the predominant wall plaster binder. However, to us and other researchers that we've spoken to, this 1840s installation is the first known installation of a gypsum heavy plaster in New York and in the United States. I do want to note that we try to sort of track down where this could have come from. We know from, as Alex pointed out in the research, we have contract documents and receipts. So we know that there was a company out of Newark that was a quarry processing plant for gypsum. And we were hoping to find them potentially being a source for the gypsum used in the wall plaster. And where the decision to use the gypsum heavy plaster came from, but we couldn't track down the details. In England in the 19th century, gypsum was the predominant wall plaster used. We know Upjohn was heavily involved in the specifics of the proportions and mixes and materials used in the construction. And Upjohn was trained in England. So it's possible that he had brought over some of this trade education. And that is why this decision was made. And just to add about the specificity of what this means for the church, gypsum is a great binder in that it's very fine, causes a nice network of material, which caused a well-bonded plaster. And we did see that in the base coat here at Trinity. We had very well-bonded plaster. The other curiosity that we found during our analysis was we found that within the finish coat layer, the finish coat actually subdivided into two separate layers. And you can see in the left photograph, even to the naked eye, this could be visible, where the red arrow points, you'll see sort of a line. Now you may remember Alex mentioning that there was a pause in work before they completed the complete finishing of the church. And we believe that this pause contributed to what we're seeing in the separation. So that they applied one layer finish coat, paused the work to finish everything on the exterior and everything that Upjohn requested, and then came back and applied a second layer. And we can see the same subdivision in our photo micrographs there. And what we're finding in our analysis actually that the first layer had cured before the second layer was applied. So it was too long of a time period. And that caused, in some places, but not all, a weak bond between the two layers. And so this outermost layer of plaster finish coat was actually separating from the bottom layer of the finish coat. You can see in this photograph, that would be an example of it. This was after some light prep had been done to the surface. Everything that you see in the sort of darker reddish brown, that is where that top layer finish coat separated off and exposed a thinner layer. One of the challenges that we had during restoration was finding a way to remove that failing layer and remove any failing finishes without damaging the well-bonded surface. Oftentimes the separating layers were caught under layers of paint, acrylic paint, that were sort of hiding what was really going on. So we had to find a way to be conservative about this. After much testing that we don't have time to get into right now, we actually found that the most efficient and safest way to get our failing layers off of the wall was to use duct tape. So what you see there in the black is actually large rolls of duct tape, and we went through multiple different types of adhesives to really identify the best one. Large rolls of duct tape were applied to all of the plaster surfaces of the wall, and then when they were removed, only what was failing removed off the wall, and what was well bonded, well adhered, remained on the wall. You can see that in these photographs on the left, you see that's a bit of rolled up duct tape with some of the failed finish layers attached to it. There on the wall, you see some removed finish layers, that's failed paint, overpaint, and that's exposed that sort of original finish. And then when you see towards the left of the photograph, you see some islands of what appears to be plaster. That is where that failed finish coat actually came off. And I know this appears a little extreme, but I do want to assure you that this really was the most conservative approach. We tried to salvage what we could, but all of the layers that were removed were layers that were already in the process of coming off anyway. And so we just basically sped that up a little bit. In the mortar, we actually also found something very interesting regarding the timeline of installation. We found that the composition of the original pointing mortar was crushed chalk whiting and red pigment in fatty acid soap medium, and there was no aggregate present in this mortar. This was very unlike typical 19th century mortars. When we looked at the mortar composition of the mortar that was installed in the scored plaster joints, we were very surprised to find that it was the same mortar composition as that of the tracery joints, which were load bearing, and the column joints. It was very interesting they chose to install true mortar into those plaster scored joints, which is really a finish layer. What's very particularly interesting is that in the mid-19th century, there was a mix of very, very similar proportions that was used in construction, but it was used as a weatherproofing material for window glazing putty. Mortars of similar composition were found in the United States. We have seen examples of it, but not until the 1870s or 1880s in Romanesque revival buildings. This is definitely the first example that we've seen and other experts have seen of this particular mortar mix being used within joints. The appearance of this mortar, due to the lack of aggregate and the binders, is it's sort of matte lustered, very, very smooth, obviously, because there's no aggregate in it. It's in pretty good composition, pretty good condition as a result. We did find that the where it remained, it was in good condition. Our goal was to install replacement mortar to match this everywhere where there had been previous repointing or missing or failing mortar. So we were able to work with Limeworks to create a great replacement mortar that had some of the properties that we needed that were more appropriate for window tracery joints, for example, but had this very similar smooth matte lustered appearance that we had in that original pointing mortar. So in summary, this combination of archival research, materials analysis, and knowledge and awareness of typical construction techniques of the time really helped us to build a more comprehensive understanding, a comprehensive story of what was going on within the building's construction history, and all of the existing conditions, really explained what we were seeing in site. And this level of research and the story that we were able to build helped us to make very confident decisions and recommendations for appropriate repairs and design approaches during the restoration. And just to finish up, we just want to show you a photo of the restoration. There had been a lot of work done within the interior Trinity Church many years prior, many restoration campaigns. Our goal was to sort of peel back some of the work that had been done and to reinstate some of the original Upjohn's design intent. So reintroduce the faux masonry finish, reintroduce some of the original pointing mortar appearance, and that's what you're seeing in the after photo.
Thanks for listening, and feel free to reach out to us if we could follow up with any questions. Thanks again.